Living in a small town myself, I can really sympathize with these creepy stories coming out from the middle of nowhere in these small populated towns. I myself live in a town with under 2,000 people in it, so imagine some of these towns where they have even less than that. These 10 people share their creepiest experiences out in these small towns. They'll give you some right frights tonight. This happened a long time ago, in the late 90s. When I was 19, I moved from Oregon to Florida to be with my boyfriend at the time. Don't ever do that. I was thinking white sand beaches and Mickey Mouse, but instead got the swamp, bugs, and dirt roads. It was huge, and it was just such a shock to my system. We lived in this dinky little town called Hawthorne, just outside of Gainesville. It's very small. It's a one stoplight and 4 stores kind of place. It had Dollar General's, Steve's Market, Eckerd's Pharmacy, and Sonny's Barbecue. Whoopee. Anyway, I got a job at the now defunct Eckerd's in the middle of town. It was next to the grocery store, so everyone shopped there. After about 3 months or so of working there, I walked into my start shift one day when my manager pulled me into his office. He laid out on his desk about 30 to 40 open letters, all addressed by hand. To me. "Do you know this person?" my manager asked. "No," I said. "Read one." So I picked the cheerful yellow one. Inside were 2 handwritten letters and a magazine cutout of a woman with long blonde hair, just like me. As the Eckerd manager watched on, I read the letter. I skipped around a lot out of confusion, desperately trying to find out why I'm in this room. From what I read, it was mostly someone imagining what spending the time with me would be like. A lot of it was sexual in nature. There were descriptions and comments about my hair, washing it, smelling it, and something about the moonlight. A few sentences were highlighted and others were underlined. My first thought was, am I getting fired or something? "Do you know this David Elrod?" I said, "Yes, I think so." The tall, lanky guy with thick glasses and frizzy dark blonde hair. The regular one who comes in a couple times a week to pick up Diet Coke and medication for his mom. He's in his late 20s and obviously socially or mentally challenged. On rare occasions, he would make small talk as I rang up his soda. Once or twice, he would linger at the register or stare at me, but I figured he was just trying to adjust his eyes or had poor social cues. Harmless compared to some of the other people that I had met in Florida, so I didn't pay him any mind, until that day in the Eckerd's office. I know he wrote the letters because of a strange encounter 2 weeks later. While working, he came up behind me and touched or caressed my hair. I had to remove it from his hands, and he apologized. Weird. No harm. I went back to work. After telling my manager this, he informed me that the customer was going to be banned from the store, and I was being sent home while they worked out the details. What details? Confused, I walked out of the store and drove home. Strange. 2 hours after I got home from my non-shift at work, there's a knock at the door. I look out the window to see what resembles a SWAT team. What the fuck? I saw men in tactical gear with large weapons, 2 men dressed in suits, and several uniformed cops. In what seemed like a slow motion at the time, I opened the door. A female officer holds up a few oddly familiar letters. "Can we come in and talk to you about these?" Realizing everyone in town has read the letters, I wanted to pass the fuck out. I don't even know the guy. We have a seat on my couch, and she begins to speak. Out of the corner of my eye, I see my boyfriend shooting dirty looks from the bedroom. The female officer mentions the letters from Eckerd's and attempting to issue a trespassing notice. They wanted to speak to him directly, she says, because her whole department is aware of David. The officers confronted him at his residence and attempted to evoke trespassing notice from Eckerd's store. Apparently he was not happy about this. He insisted for over 45 minutes how this was all a big mistake, and I wanted to talk to him. He was so combative and persistent, they decided to pursue stalking charges. Stalking charges? She continues, "You need to be aware that David killed and partially dismembered his mother when he was 12 years old. He was released from a juvenile psychiatric facility less than 4 years ago. We found disturbing materials at his home," she continued. "We believe he's been stalking you." My mind kept wandering. David was arrested the next day for stalking after he was found in the Eckards parking lot. The last official word was that he went back to the psychiatric hospital, at least temporarily. I didn't have the chance to read the letters in full before they were entered into some vault of evidence, nor did they explain what they found at his house, so I never had the complete picture of what was happening. My boyfriend at the time was a huge dick about the whole thing, so I moved back to Oregon a week later. Besides, who wants to hang around Norman Bates? This only happened less than an hour ago, and I still feel pretty creeped out by the whole thing. A dude followed me around the supermarket. He blatantly stared at me several occasions, and stood right behind me in my own personal space in the line for the self-service checkouts. He collected his coins and items by one when he finished checking out at the register right beside mine. He then waited out in the front with a friend, another male he was also shopping with, but separately, meaning I had to walk past them and get in my car. Before they started walking off, as I was reversing out but had to stop to let passing traffic by, a third, younger male walked up beside my car and stood next to my window waving, smiling. He had brown, rotten front teeth, and saying something that I couldn't understand. I waved back, a damn desire to be polite, but I didn't wind down my window. I reversed out. As I drove out of the car park, he walked to the other side and stood by my car again as I drove out. Feeling spooked, I drove to another supermarket and sat in their car park for about 10 minutes. I then went inside and did another small grocery shop there. Different supermarkets equals different sales. When I finished, I packed up my car and began to drive off, only to see the man who approached my car standing outside of the store opposite that shares the car park with a supermarket. He ran over to another male, literally ran, who had a hoodie on, with the hood up, grabbed his phone off of him and began speedily, what I can only assume he was, texting on the phone as I drove past him. I took a weird route home, and made sure no one was driving behind me for the last few turns. But I still feel gross. When I checked my car, I noticed that one of my tires, the small centerpiece of the hub, was missing. I'm hoping it just fell off at some point and I didn't notice. I go back to work tomorrow, and we have to park on the street. My place of work is 1 to 2 blocks from each of those supermarkets, and I live in a tiny, rural town, so I'm not feeling excited about the idea. Being raised by a police officer, my gut instinct is usually pretty spot on, and this whole incident left me feeling pretty gross. A small town church is probably the last place one would expect a paranormal experience. But here we are. When I was in high school, so about 12 years ago, my friends and I spent a lot of time in the church youth room, which was in a separate outbuilding from the church. My buddy's dad was the youth pastor, so we had access to the key and were trusted to use the space. We would listen to music, play games, and just generally mess around. One summer, all 3 of us had been getting really into the Bible study we were doing, and had decided to devote at least one night of youth room time to legitimate religious prayer and devotion. We tried to do this in the youth room, and failed. We used the key that we kept in the cabinet to get out of the church proper. We used the key kept in the cabinet to get into the church proper, to use the sanctuary, fully believing that we could focus better in there. The church was smallish, the original building no more than a decent sanctuary with a balcony in the back, regular seats, and the pulpit stage behind the altar at the front. It had a basement fellowship hall under it, and they had built on an education wing to the side in the 60s and 70s that had a nursery, an office, and a set of classrooms upstairs. We came in the pastor's office, walk down the short hall, up the stairs and into the sanctuary. At the sanctuary landing, immediately to your left, there are stairs leading up to the classrooms. We had been turning on the lights as we went, so the office, hall, and now front of the sanctuary were lit. The other rooms, upward stairway, and under balcony were all shaded, as we had only lit the front or altar area. We went about holding our prayer, and shared joys and concerns to be prayed over. We ended the prayer and had proceeded to discuss whatever great religious matter 15 to 17-year-olds could come up with when I stopped talking. The other two continued, but I had been struck mentally with this hard, persuasive image. I saw 2 feet, pale, yellowed toenails, and clearly belonging to a dead man, hanging about a foot above the floor at the end of the far end of the hallway we had come down. I didn't see the man's face, just his feet and half of his shins, hanging above the floor. I was sitting in the front pew, back to the doors we had come through. No one in the front of the sanctuary can see into the hallway. It was all in my mind, but I could not shake the image. I tried, but I kept seeing them, hanging and moving slowly toward the stairs leading to where we were. No steps were being taken, and it wasn't hovering. They were hanging and just coasting forward, slowly. I assumed I was being paranoid, and tried to push it out of my mind. I looked hard at the other two, who were sitting on the altar and facing me, and thus the door also. They had kind of realized I wasn't talking and looked over at me. I looked back suddenly, and they both had this look of shocked horror. I turned around and asked what they saw. There was nothing there, but they both claimed that they had seen something whip around the corner from the hall and around the corner up the stairs to the balcony area. It was just right, the amount of time it would have taken for my hanging man to have covered the last few feet of the stairs to the sanctuary landing. I asked what it had looked like, and they just said a black shadow with no real form to it. I was terrified. I had seen it in my mind's eye, and they had seen it with their real ones. In order to leave, we had to go that way, and we were all terrified. I hadn't mentioned to them what I had seen yet, but there was a sense of knowing that I had felt something too. Being a foolhardy youth, I took up a Bible and steeled myself. I walked back to the shadowed stairs, demanding whatever had gone up there to either come out and be gone. It was the bluster of a child, but there was no conviction behind it. Whatever we had seen never showed itself to us again, but we also avoided that place from then on. At one point in my life, I stayed in a house that was located in the center of a small town in Mexico. This was a 2-story house that seemed like it was used as a small roofed neighborhood where multiple families could live. On the first floor was a small living room, the garage, the kitchen, 1 bedroom, a bathroom, and a roofed patio area that had stairs to access the second floor. The second floor had 4 bedrooms and another living room. 3 of the bedrooms on the second floor overlooked the first floor, right above the kitchen and the bedroom downstairs. Before we moved into the house, my whole family had gone to this house to check it out and clean it up since it had been vacant for quite some time. During the time we lived there, a few weird things happened. During our initial cleaning, we noticed that only 1 bedroom downstairs had a small new wall that was made of brick and cement that was never plastered or finished to look good. In the same room, we noticed a small black handprint on the cement. They were about the size of a 3 or 4-year-old's hand. We figured that they were from the previous tenants, and the kids were playing with something and left marks on the wall. My family and I painted over those interior walls white and left for the night since we weren't moving in quite yet. The next day we came back to the house and noticed that in the same room the small handprints were back on the wall, in the same room. We paid little attention to it at first and painted over them again. We tried to play it down since we were going to live there for a bit, but we were generally concerned because that was really weird. Once we moved in, Someone in my family found a small wooden airplane that had a string running up through the center of it. It was seemingly segmented so that you could pull on the string and the plane would reassemble in a sense. Over the course of the months we lived there, we noticed that no matter where we placed this toy, it would end up somewhere else the next morning. We joked about the little boy named Carlitos, and was saying that he was playing with the toy and moved it around while we slept. We never found out where that toy came from, since it wasn't there when we moved in. When my dad was growing up, my great-grandparents lived in a small farming town in Illinois. For the most part, the town was quiet and peaceful. In the mid-'80s, a friend of my great-grandmother, Gina, came to her with the news that one of her sons had turned up dead. He had gotten involved with drugs, and it was suspected that a gang tracked him down. The police weren't getting anywhere, so Gina decided to investigate the murder herself. One night in April, a few months after Gina's son was killed, Gina was found dead in a field. According to my great-grandmother, Gina was very close to cracking the case. However, the death was ruled a suicide by local police, and everybody moved on. Everybody except for my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother knew that pretty much everything about the case, as Gina had continued to update her as she tried to solve it. So, she picked up where Gina left off and began asking folks around town if they knew anything. One night, my great-grandparents came home from a day in town. My great-grandma went into the house and almost immediately heard the phone ringing. Not thinking anything of it, she picked it up and answered. On the other side of the line was a man who said,
"If you don't mind your own business, you're going to end up in the field like your friend."
The next day, my grandfather bought his first gun. Looking back, it's creepy to think that a man on the phone called so soon after they got home. I'm glad that my great-grandmother stopped searching and that my great-grandfather took precautions in order to protect his family. Both of my great-grandparents lived long lives, and Gina's husband ended up remarrying and moving out of state. I was 17. I'm in my mid-20s now. I worked at a local grocery store in a small mundane town. Being a high school student, I worked evenings and got out around 10:30 p.m. I walked home every single night, and I had worked there since I was 15. It was in my area, where I grew up, so I never had any real fear. Thankfully though, I was still alert. On this night, I was about halfway home, passing my local 24-hour convenience store. I always became more alert after this point because until then, I was walking on a well-lit main road, and I could probably motivate my stubby little legs to sprint to the store if anything happened. After that, it's small residential roads with many a dark place to hide for myself or murderers. I walked past the store and noticed a few cars parked outside. Nothing out of the ordinary. I crossed the street and descended into the dark residential area. It's worth noting that not many cars really drive down these streets, especially this late at night. As I'm walking, I see two really bright lights roll up behind me. Obviously a car, and honestly not super strange at this point. I keep walking, but I turn my head to try and see what the car looked like or who might be inside. I can't see shit, because this car's lights are super bright. I speed up a little, but this car keeps slowly following behind, creeping closer and closer. I am on full shitting myself mode at this point, but I don't quite break into a run because it's still a ways to my house, and the car could easily catch up with me. This may seem stupid, but I watched a lot of animal and nature shows, and the one thing they always say is a trademark of a prey is running. I guess I thought if I walked confidently enough, it would scare them off. At any rate, there was a corner coming up onto a very small road that leads to the street that I live on. So I decided not to go into full-blown panic mode unless this car follows me down this street. I quicken my pace, turn the corner and look back. The lights are finally out of my eyes, and I can sort of see the car. It had stopped where I had turned. I absolutely shit myself because I remember seeing the car parked at the convenience store, and to my absolute horror, the car slowly starts to turn the corner. I freak out and scramble to find my phone, but I fucking forgot it at work like a moron. So I pulled out my iPod Touch and pretend it's a phone to at least make it seem like I'm talking to someone. I turn around, iPod to my ear, and look this car dead in the windshield, lights still blinding, and throw it the dirtiest look I've ever in my life. I hear the window go down, and the motherfucker starts cooing at me, like some real dove noises, and I just freaking book it. I hear the car speed up behind me, and as soon as I round the corner to get onto my street, I dive into some of my neighbor's bushes, because I knew I wouldn't be able to make it to my house before the car caught up. I sat and waited. The car came slowly around the corner and just stops ahead of the place that I was hiding, and continues cooing. This guy is freaking crazy. I was prepared to sit there for the whole night, because I was pretty convinced they didn't know where I was. A couple of moments go by, and the car just suddenly takes off, and never have I been so relieved. It was dark, so I didn't catch its plate numbers, and the worst part of this was, I saw the car switch off its high beams. All I could think was that they may have been turned on purposely to blind me. I stay hidden for a bit, because I'm afraid the car is lurking somewhere. Adrenaline eventually took over though, and I just started sprinting home. I got in the house and just started bawling my eyes out. I was absolutely inconsolable. Hyperventilating, full body shakes, dry heaving, the whole 9 yards. I had never been so afraid for my life, and it wasn't until I got home that I finally started to register that fear. It was just my poor, 15-year-old brother who was home, and he had no idea what to do. After I calmed down, I called the police, but nothing happened. I didn't have a very good description of the vehicle besides its color and make, and never saw who was driving. The reason why this story sticks out in my head is because not a month later, a young girl who was very drunk was snatched from the side of the road about 10 blocks from where I had been walking. The guy took her, raped her, and was never caught. There is no way to know for sure if it was related, but I shudder to think what might have happened if I did not dive into the bush. In small town, rural Tennessee, kids played outside until there was no light to see by, and even then, they found ways to stay out until brought inside by threat of punishment. I was no exception. One Saturday evening, when I was 2 months into turning 12, as I was coming inside from playing, I was stopped in my tracks by a strange sound. A mix of yipping growling into a barking growl. Coming from an easy 30 or so yards away, I was intrigued. I stood in front of the porch, looking into the tree line, trying to find the source of this sound. I expect a dog to emerge, as people were always dumping their dogs in the country, and it was rare these animals ever found homes. Most dogs roamed the woods. Sitting down on the porch steps, I waited for what I thought would be one of these dogs. But nothing ever came out. After a solid 10 minutes and a loss of more of the dwindling light, I stood to go inside. The sound came again, this time deeper and much more guttural. It chilled me, the sound. Looking out into the trees, I saw a very tall figure. It moved in between them. It was taller than the fence outlining the trees, and they were a good 4 to 5 feet tall. I took hold of the door. This sound came again, and I felt it go through me. It's difficult to explain. I felt as though if I was rooted to the spot that I was in. I opened the door and moved a step inside. My eyes were locked on the spot where this thing moved toward the fence. I saw a slice of what looked like shadow coming to life, but I saw a slice of what looked like the shadow coming into life. What I thought to be a hand on the fence. I didn't wait for more. I stepped inside the house and closed the door after me. I have never spoken of this to another person before now. Although I've never doubted what I saw, I've never had a name for it. I saw no real features other than a vague outline, but what prompted me to share this were the details of that outline. It had arms of impossible length and 2 ears on the side of its head that were long and slender. Its upper torso had broad, long shoulders that tapered down. I couldn't see the legs for the fence, nor its feet. I'd never heard the term dogman until about a month or so ago. I haven't been 12 for several long years now, but I know that's what I saw on the tree line. What else could it possibly have been? Several years ago, my family lived in a sketchy area of a small town in South Carolina. Our neighbor 2 doors down was a well-known drug dealer, and there were always shady people walking up and down our street and through our yard late at night. Now, my fiance is a night owl, and I worked nights, so we were always up late. My daughters weren't in school yet, and thankfully liked to sleep in as much as we did, so it wasn't uncommon for he and I to be up at 2 or 3 in the morning watching TV and playing internet poker. We didn't have curtains or blinds on most of the windows, so it was obvious that we were awake and in a brightly lit living room that was late at night. Everyone in the neighborhood was also familiar with our 2 oversized Czech German Shepherd dogs. Our female was around 160 pounds, and our male was around 120 pounds. They could also both be seen through the window at night by anyone looking in. So, for a few weeks, we'd been having issues with hearing sounds outside at night. But, when we went to check, typically the person would be gone, and we'd find nothing but a pry bar near the window where they'd been trying to get in. By the time we moved from that neighborhood, we had a collection of them that we'd found around the outside of our house. What couldn't be seen through the windows was that my fiance had drilled holes through both wooden frames from each window, and then had them held in place with 3-inch nails, so they couldn't be opened without taking the nails out of the holes. One night, we were sitting in the living room at around 3 in the morning, and we hear a sound at the window directly between our 2 computers. The dogs are sitting in the front of the window just growling and staring out. And when we looked outside, we could see a guy trying to pry the window open. We both stood in front of the window staring at him. The dogs were barking, but he was so drugged up apparently he didn't notice any of us there until my fiance knocked on the window. He ran off, and my fiance headed out to collect his pry bar. We figured that would be the end of it. But the next night, the same guy was at it again, at a different window in the living room. The process repeated, my fiance knocking on the window and scaring him off, and then collecting the pry bar. When he showed up on the 3rd night, we decided we had enough. This time, instead of knocking on the window, my fiance went outside without alerting him. So this guy was trying to break into the house. First, my fiance steps out into the porch. He's about 6'5", but skinny, and uses a cane a large portion of the time. So despite his height, he appears pretty non-threatening. When the guy noticed him there, he didn't try to run this time, apparently thinking he could take him. They stared each other down for a few minutes. When the guy raised the pry bar like he was going to move towards my fiance, all hell broke loose. My fiance, despite using a cane, is fast when he needs to be. In an instant, he popped open the front door, releasing both dogs, and at the same time, he pulled a machete out of the back of his pants and took off after the guy. So here this guy thinks he's gonna get an easy target, only to be chased down by nearly 300 combined pounds of snarling teeth and muscle and a crazy skinny white guy with a machete. I've never seen a crackhead run so fast. All I can say is he didn't come back for a 4th night. A few years ago, when I was still young enough to feel invulnerable, I decided to drive solo from a writer's program in upstate New York to my parents' house in Texas. My father and I are seasoned road trippers, and while I'd never driven a distance like that one, I'd have a safe and reliable car, plenty of cash and an AAA membership, so I figured nothing could go wrong, especially if I stayed on the main roads. On the second day of the trip, I left my friend's apartment in Arlington, Virginia, bright and early on a Sunday, hoping to get the bulk of the driving done in the daylight. After about 2 or 3 hours, I was in a remote part of the state, passing the very few other cars on the road at about 10 miles over the speed limit. Somewhere along the line, I realized that a burgundy 90s looking coupe, I want to say it was a Pontiac Grand Prix, but I could be misremembering, has been holding steady behind me for about 20 minutes. I figured the driver had just been using me as a pace car, since I've been going a little faster than I should. This continues on the same highway for about an hour and a half before I decide to pull over and get some gas in the middle of nowhere mountain town. When I exit, so does the burgundy car. It causes a pang of anxiety somewhere in my chest, but I pull into the nearest gas station as planned and filled up my car. For those wondering, it was a little red sedan with Texas plates and my university sticker affixed in the rear window. A car that kind of screams a 22-year-old female, which I was. As I'm doing this, the burgundy car rolls up and parks at the edge of the lot, but no one gets out of the car. At this point, I'm mildly freaked. I move my car to the other end of the lot, deciding to buy a bag of chips inside the convenience store and wait it outside. I also call my mom and leave her a message, noting that I'm in X town in Virginia, and that I'm planning to stop for the night in Tennessee. I promise to call later that night and try not to sound worried. She's a classic overreactor, and was already upset that I was making the trip alone in the first place. 20 minutes later, I peek out the front door and yep, the burgundy car is still there, and no one has stepped out. At this point, I feel sick. At that age, I would have done anything to avoid confrontation, so I choose to go to the bathroom and wait 10 more minutes in the stall. I tell myself that if that car is still there when I get out, I will call the police. When I emerge from the bathroom, the burgundy car has moved. It is now directly next to my car, and I can see the man in the driver's seat. He is fat, white, and balding. He's wearing sunglasses, but I'm pretty sure he's looking directly at me. Something about the way he's looking at me makes me feel more furious than terrified. I make a big show of pulling my cell phone out of my pocket and dialing numbers while I'm staring at his license plate. Within 10 seconds, he backs his car out of the space and whipped out of the lot, presumably heading for the freeway. This happened around this time last year, when I was a junior in high school. There was this kid in my first period, which was criminal justice, who never talked. Not to be rude, but he was your stereotypical, don't mess with that kid or he'll pull out a gun. Whenever someone in my class would talk to him, he always had a snarky or disrespectful comment to say. He never did his assignments, and always had this stern look on his face. He was also very strange. I think he was socially awkward and didn't know how to talk to people, because each time he would talk to us, it was uncomfortable for us and him. One morning, this kid came to school and acted out of the ordinary. He sat in a different seat and didn't have his backpack on him. After the teacher took roll call, he left the room to go to the portable next door to us, which is also a criminal justice class. The kid walks out of the class without telling anyone and didn't come back. Once my first period ended, I forgot all about him and went to my chemistry class when we were suddenly put into a code red. We were all confused and scared since we just had our drill the previous week and had no information for this code red. My entire class hid in the chemicals closet for 2 hours during this whole thing. I remember getting texts from my mom asking if I was okay, and I asked her what happened, if she knew anything, and she didn't. At around 11 of that day, we were in a code green and went with our day without knowing why we were on lockdown. When we went back to the school the next day, we asked my criminal justice teacher what had happened. He told us that mean kid in our class ditched after he took attendance and walked a half mile to the gas station up the street from the school and robbed it. Authorities were called. The SWAT team arrested him in the woods surrounding our school, where he ditched his backpack. This kid was armed and loaded with a gun on his person during class, which I was in. My teacher said that he dropped his backpack on the trail in the woods so that when he was done robbing the gas station, that he could just blend in with the rest of the school, and that no one would suspect him. A really messed up part of this is that he was wearing a killer clown mask while he did it, and this was during that time that people were going around dressed up as clowns and chasing cars. It's unsettling for me to know that I was in the same room as this kid before he committed that crime and had a loaded gun literally on him. Someone could have pissed this kid off and he could have just shot up the school, or who knows what.